You have 72 hours to dismantle that monstrosity, or I will have it torn down myself and bill you for the demolition. That was the first time Carol ever spoke to me directly. Not a hello, not a welcome to the neighborhood, just a declaration of war over a 10-by-12 garden shed. I had moved to Maple Creek Estates seeking peace. After my wife, Sarah, passed away, the old house felt cavernous, each room echoing with a silence that was louder than any noise. This new place was supposed to be a blank slate, a quiet corner of the world where I could grieve and, eventually, start to rebuild. I am a county building inspector. My life is governed by codes, regulations, and the precise, unyielding logic of load-bearing walls and proper setbacks. I find comfort in rules. They make sense. People, on the other hand, rarely did. Especially people like Carol. She was the self-appointed queen of our little suburban kingdom, the president of the Homeowners Association. She patrolled the pristine streets in her golf cart, a clipboard her scepter and a look of perpetual disapproval her crown. She was a woman who seemed to be powered by the petty grievances of others, a connoisseur of infractions. The shed was my sanctuary. It was where I kept Sarah's woodworking tools. She had loved the smell of sawdust, the feel of raw timber becoming something new under her hands. Building that shed, organizing her chisels and saws, it was the closest I could get to having a conversation with her. It was a memorial made of cedar and galvanized steel, built perfectly to code, mind you. I should know. So when I found the notice taped to my front door, written in an aggressive, all-caps font, my first reaction was not anger, but a weary sort of annoyance. The letter cited a bylaw about unapproved external structures. I pulled out my copy of the HOA covenants, a document thick enough to be a legal weapon, and read the section carefully. It was vaguely worded, clearly designed for maximum interpretive power by whoever was in charge. But it did specify that structures on a permanent foundation or over 150 square feet required board approval. My shed was on skids, not a concrete slab, and it was exactly 120 square feet. I was in the clear. I wrote a polite, concise letter back to the HOA, quoting the specific bylaw and explaining why my shed was in compliance. I even attached a copy of the manufacturer's spec sheet. I dropped it in the community mailbox and figured that would be the end of it. Logic and reason, I thought, would prevail. I was so naive. A week later, the fines started. $50 for continued noncompliance. It arrived in a stark white envelope, the fee highlighted in angry yellow. I ignored it. 2 weeks later, another one arrived. $100. This time, it included a grainy, zoomed-in photo of my shed, circled in red marker like evidence in a murder trial. I started seeing Carol more often. Her golf cart would slow to a crawl as it passed my house. I'd be watering the hydrangeas Sarah loved, and I'd feel her eyes on me, a physical weight of judgment. She never waved. She just stared, her lips a thin, unyielding line. It was a siege of silent disapproval. The conflict was a low, buzzing static in the background of my grief. I tried to focus on my work, on the quiet routine of my life. I went to the job site, I inspected foundations, I signed off on framing, I came home. But the thought of that woman and her vendetta against my little wooden box was a splinter in my mind, nagging and persistent. My neighbor, Frank, a retired cop with a bulldog's face and a surprisingly gentle demeanor, caught me one afternoon while I was mowing the lawn. He leaned over the fence, his hands calloused from years of gardening. "Having fun with Queen Carol yet?" he asked, a wry smile playing on his lips. I shut off the mower. "You could say that. She seems to have a personal problem with my shed." Frank chuckled, a low rumble. "Son, Carol has a personal problem with oxygen if she thinks someone else is breathing it wrong. She's been running this neighborhood like her own private fiefdom for 10 years. Most people just pay the fines and hope she moves on to the next victim. I'm not paying a fine for something that isn't a violation," I said, my jaw tightening. It was the principle of the thing. The rules were the rules. You couldn't just invent them as you went along. "That's the spirit," Frank said, though his eyes held a warning. "Just be careful. She doesn't fight fair. She doesn't fight with rules. She fights with noise, shame, and sheer, bloody-minded persistence." He was right. The next phase of her attack was public shaming. A notice went up on the community bulletin board near the pool. It didn't name me, but it was obvious. A reminder to all residents, it read, that unapproved structures detract from our community's aesthetic and property values. Certain homeowners who refuse to comply will be subject to escalating fines and legal action. The passive-aggressive capitalization was her signature move. Then came the complaint to the county. This, I had to admit, was a bold move. It was also incredibly stupid. The complaint landed, as all building-related complaints did, in the digital inbox of my department. My boss, a perpetually stressed man named Dave, called me into his office. "Mark," he said, sliding a printout across his desk. "Got a complaint from a concerned citizen in Maple Creek Estates. Something about an illegal structure at 127 Briar Lane." He paused, looking at me over his glasses. "Isn't that your address?" "It is," I said calmly. "It's my shed. It's fully compliant with both county code and the HOA bylaws." Dave sighed. "I figured as much. This woman, Carol, has called here before about other things. She wanted to know if her neighbor's basketball hoop met wind load requirements." "A basketball hoop?" He shook his head. "Look, I have to treat this as an official complaint. I need you to formally inspect the structure and file a report." "You want me to inspect my own shed? And file a report clearing yourself of any wrongdoing," he said, a glint of humor in his eyes. "Make it thorough. Use lots of official-sounding language. It'll drive her nuts." So I did. I went home, took out my official clipboard, and performed the most thorough inspection ever conducted on a garden shed. I checked the framing, the anchoring, the setback from the property line, a generous 15 feet, far exceeding the required 5. I wrote up a 4-page report complete with diagrams and citations from the International Building Code. I declared the structure at 127 Briar Lane to be exemplary in its construction and in full compliance with all applicable county ordinances. I filed the report, and a copy was automatically mailed to the complainant. I imagined Carol opening that letter, her face contorting like she'd bitten into a lemon. The victory felt good, but it was short-lived. I had won a battle using my weapons, logic, rules, and bureaucracy. But Carol wasn't interested in that kind of war. A few days later, I came home from work to find it. The turning point. The moment the low, buzzing annoyance in my head became a cold, focused rage. She had trespassed. She had walked across my lawn, into my backyard, my private space, and she had defaced my memorial to my wife. Stapled directly into the beautiful cedar siding of the shed was a huge, laminated sign. In bright, garish red letters, it read, "Final Notice, Violation." The staples had splintered the wood. 2 angry, metallic wounds in the grain that Sarah and I had picked out together. It was a small thing, just a couple of staple holes. But it felt like a desecration. She had crossed a line that wasn't on any plat map. She had made it personal. I stood there for a long time, just staring at the sign. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lawn. In that moment, something inside me shifted. The grief that had softened my edges for the past year began to harden, crystallizing into something sharp and unyielding. The peace-seeking man who had moved to Maple Creek was gone. In his place stood a building inspector who had just seen his project red-tagged by an unqualified, malicious amateur. And I was going to bring the full weight of the code down on her. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at my dining room table with a glass of whiskey and my laptop. I pulled up every public record I could find on Maple Creek Estates. I downloaded the original development plans, the county permits for the common areas, the HOA's tax filings. I was no longer just defending my shed. I was conducting a full structural audit of Carol's entire reign. The bylaws were my building code. The public records were my blueprints. And I was looking for the cracks in her foundation. It didn't take long to find them. Her signature project, the one she crowed about in every HOA newsletter, was the new gazebo in the center of the community park. It was an ornate, oversized thing, a monument to her own perceived importance. I searched the county permit database. There was no permit on file. Not for the structure, not for the electrical wiring for the fancy lights she'd had installed, not for the concrete foundation it sat on. From a county perspective, that gazebo didn't legally exist. It was an illegal structure. The irony was so thick I could taste it. I kept digging. The newsletter archives mentioned a major irrigation system upgrade last summer, another one of Carol's pet projects. The cost, according to the treasurer's report, was astronomical. I searched for the plumbing permits. Nothing. Frank's words echoed in my head. She doesn't fight fair. Well, neither would I. But I would fight with the truth. I would use her own obsession with rules to dismantle her, piece by piece. The first step was to set a trap. I needed to document her behavior, to build a case file that was as solid as the rebar in a skyscraper's foundation. The next morning, I went out and bought a set of high-definition security cameras. They were small, discreet, and motion-activated. I installed one under the eaves of my house, aimed directly at the shed and the back gate. I put another one covering my front door and lawn. I was building my own evidence locker. Then, I carefully removed her sign from the shed. I took close-up photos of the damage from the staples. I saved the sign itself, placing it in a large evidence bag. I was treating this like a professional investigation, because that's exactly what it had become. My plan wasn't just to get her to leave me alone. My plan was to remove her. The problem wasn't the violation notice on my shed, the shed was just a symptom. The problem was Carol. She was the faulty wiring, the crumbling foundation, the toxic mold hiding in the walls of the community. And I was the inspector who was going to condemn the whole rotten structure. The next HOA notice arrived a week later. It was a certified letter, a classic escalation tactic. It informed me that a lien was being placed on my property for the unpaid fines, which had now ballooned to $500. It also stated that the board had scheduled a special hearing to authorize the forced removal of my unauthorized structure. I smiled. This was exactly what I wanted. A public forum. A stage. I spent the next 2 weeks preparing for that meeting like a lawyer preparing for a capital case. I organized my files. I printed out the county records showing the lack of permits for the gazebo. I created a timeline of her harassment, complete with photos of the notices and the big red sign. I saved the footage from my security camera to a thumb drive. It hadn't taken long for the camera to pay off. Just 3 nights after I installed it, at 2:17 a.m., the motion sensor alerted my phone. I watched the live feed as a shadowy figure crept into my backyard. It was Carol. She was in her pajamas and a bathrobe, armed with a tape measure and a flashlight. The footage was crystal clear as she measured the shed from every angle, as if trying to will it into being larger than it was. She peered into the windows, her face pressed against the glass. The camera caught it all. Trespassing. Invasion of privacy. It was a gift. The night of the HOA meeting, I put on a suit and tie. It felt like armor. I walked into the community clubhouse, my briefcase in hand. The room was filled with about 30 residents. Most of them looked bored or annoyed to be there. This was just another tedious Tuesday night in suburbia. They had no idea what was coming. Carol was sitting at the head of a long table with the other 2 board members, a mousy-looking treasurer and a beefy man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. She saw me walk in and a smug, triumphant smirk spread across her face. She thought I was a lamb walking to the slaughter. She had no idea I was the butcher. She called the meeting to order and droned on about landscaping budgets and pool pump maintenance. Then, she got to the main event. And finally, she said, her voice dripping with false solemnity, "We must address the ongoing and flagrant violation at 127 Briar Lane." She fixed her gaze on me. "Mr. Miller, despite numerous warnings and fines, you have refused to remove the illegal structure from your property. The board is therefore here tonight to vote on the final measures, which include a property lien and the scheduling of a contractor for removal at your expense." She looked around the room, basking in her power. "Does anyone have any questions before the board votes?" Silence. Most people were staring at their phones. They'd seen this show before. Someone gets crosswise with Carol, they get publicly flogged, and life goes on. I raised my hand. Carol's eyes narrowed. "Yes, Mr. Miller. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" "I do," I said, my voice calm and even. I stood up and walked to the front of the room. "But it's not about my shed. My shed is perfectly legal, as confirmed by the official report from the county inspector's office, a copy of which I have for anyone who's interested." I paused, letting that sink in. A few people looked up from their phones. No, I have a question for you, Carol. It's about a much larger structure. The community gazebo. Her smug expression flickered. A flash of confusion, then annoyance. What about the gazebo? It's a beautiful asset to our community. I agree, it is beautiful, I said. But as a matter of public record and safety, I was hoping you could provide the board with the county permit number for its construction. Specifically for the foundation and the electrical wiring. I seem to have misplaced my copy. The room was silent now. Everyone was watching her. The treasurer started shuffling papers nervously. The beefy board member was frowning. Carol's face began to turn a blotchy red. That's a procedural matter. It was all handled correctly. We are not here to discuss the gazebo. Aren't we? I pressed, keeping my tone light and inquisitive. This is a meeting about the enforcement of rules regarding structures, is it not? I would think the largest structure the HOA has built in the last 5 years would be a prime example of following those rules. Unless, of course, it wasn't handled correctly. An unpermitted structure with uninspected electrical wiring on common property, that sounds like a massive liability for every single homeowner here, doesn't it? A murmur went through the crowd. People were sitting up straighter. They were no longer bored. Frank, sitting in the back, gave me a subtle nod. This is an outrage. Carol sputtered, slamming her hand on the table. You are trying to deflect from your own violation. I'm simply asking a question about our community's assets and potential liabilities, I replied smoothly. But if you don't have the permit number handy, I understand. Perhaps the treasurer has the records for the contractor who was paid for the work. I'm sure a licensed contractor would have pulled the necessary permits. The mousy treasurer looked like he was about to faint. He stared at Carol, his eyes wide with panic. Carol stood up, her whole body trembling with rage. This meeting is over. The board will vote in private. I don't think so, a voice called out from the back. It was Frank. According to the bylaws, a vote on a lien has to be held in an open meeting. We, the homeowners, have a right to hear this. Carol was trapped. Her face was a mask of fury. She had lost control of the room. The seed of doubt I had planted was sprouting, and its roots were cracking the foundation of her authority. She glared at me, and in her eyes, I saw not just anger, but a flicker of genuine fear. It was a beautiful sight. The meeting ended in chaos. The board didn't vote. Carol adjourned abruptly and practically ran from the room. It was a tactical retreat, but she had sustained heavy damage. Several homeowners came up to me afterward, their faces a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. Is that true? One woman asked. About the gazebo. You can check the public records yourself, I said, handing her a slip of paper with the county website address on it. It's all there. Or rather, it's not. I had won the battle, but I knew the war was far from over. I had publicly humiliated her. A woman like Carol wouldn't let that stand. She would retaliate, and it would be vicious. I went home feeling a grim sense of satisfaction, but also a knot of tension in my stomach. I checked the feed from my security cameras. The perimeter was secure. For now. The retaliation came faster and dirtier than I could have imagined. Carol, realizing she couldn't beat me on the battlefield of rules and regulations, decided to burn the whole village down. She launched a smear campaign that was breathtaking in its audacity. A new notice appeared on the community bulletin board. This one was personal. It has come to the board's attention, it began, that a certain resident with a history of noncompliance may be abusing his position as a county employee to intimidate the HOA. Furthermore, concerns have been raised about his increasingly erratic and aggressive behavior. Please keep your children at a safe distance and report any suspicious activity. She was painting me as a corrupt, unstable predator. It was libelous, slanderous, and utterly insane. I took a high-resolution photo of the notice before tearing it down. More evidence for my file. Then came the call to my boss. Dave called me into his office again, but this time he didn't look amused. He looked exhausted. Mark, I don't know what the hell is going on over there, but this Carol woman just spent 20 minutes on the phone with me, he said, rubbing his temples. She accused you of everything from extortion to running a secret cult out of your garden shed. She demanded you be fired immediately for using your official capacity to wage a personal vendetta. I felt a surge of cold fury. And what did you say? I told her that your work for the county is impeccable and that if she had a formal complaint, she could submit it in writing through the proper channels, Dave said. But Mark, this is getting ugly. Be careful. People like that can cause a lot of trouble, even if they're completely unhinged. I know, I said. I'm being very careful. The final straw, the act that stripped away any last shred of restraint I might have had, was what she did next. It wasn't a notice or a phone call. It was a post on the neighborhood's private social media page. Someone sent me a screenshot. It was a picture of my house, taken from the street. Carol had written a long, rambling caption. It was full of innuendo and outright lies about me. But it was the last sentence that made my blood run cold. We don't know what really happened to his poor wife, she wrote, but his obsessive behavior over a shed where he spends all his time is deeply disturbing. A man with so many secrets is a danger to us all. She had brought Sarah into it. She had used my grief, the most sacred and painful part of my life, as a weapon to sling mud at me. That was it. The gloves were off. The building inspector was done with his audit. It was time for a demolition. My plan had been to slowly expose her, to let her own arrogance and corruption be her undoing. But this attack changed the timeline. This required a swift, decisive, and overwhelming response. This required the final, irrefutable piece of evidence that would not just remove her from power, but bury her under a mountain of legal trouble. I had found the financial irregularities, the doctored invoices for the irrigation system. The contractor was a company called C&J Landscaping. The J, I knew, was her husband, John. I suspected that C was her. But the invoices were submitted by the company, and proving she was directly involved in the fraud would be difficult. I needed a witness. I needed someone from the inside. I had no idea that help was about to come from the most unlikely of sources. A few days after the social media post, I was in my garage, trying to lose myself in the simple, honest work of sanding a piece of oak. A young man I vaguely recognized from the neighborhood was hovering at the end of my driveway. He looked nervous, constantly glancing over his shoulder. He was probably about 20, with the awkward, lanky build of someone still growing into his own frame. I turned off the sander. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice wary. He shuffled his feet. Are you Mr. Miller?" "I am." He took a deep breath and walked towards me, pulling a folded envelope from his back pocket. "My name is Kevin," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Kevin Jenkins." Jenkins. The same last name as Carol. It was her son. My mom. He started, then trailed off, shaking his head. "What she's doing is wrong. The things she's saying about you, about your wife, it's not right." I just stood there, waiting. I didn't know what to say. He held out the envelope. "I work for my uncle's landscaping company sometimes in the summer. C&J Landscaping. My dad is John. My mom is Carol. It's their company." My heart started beating faster. "My mom does all the books," Kevin continued, his eyes fixed on the ground. "She makes 2 sets of invoices for the HOA jobs. One with the real costs, and one with, inflated numbers. She told my dad it was for administrative overhead. I found the real ones on her computer. I printed them out." He pushed the envelope into my hand. "I don't want to be involved," he said quickly. "But I can't let her keep doing this. She's destroying everything." With that, he turned and practically ran down the street, disappearing around the corner. I went inside and sat down at my kitchen table, my hands trembling slightly as I opened the envelope. Inside were 2 sets of invoices for the irrigation project. One showed a total cost of $42,000. The other, the one submitted to the HOA treasurer, was for $85,000. It was all there, in black and white. Line by line, the numbers were padded, doubled, tripled. It was blatant, undeniable fraud. This was the kill shot. This was the steel beam that would bring the whole corrupt structure crashing down. I picked up the phone and called Frank. "Frank, it's Mark," I said. I need your advice. I have concrete, documentary proof of felony embezzlement. Who do we call? There was a pause on the other end of the line, then a low whistle. Well, I'll be, Frank said. You really did it. You got her. Don't do anything. Don't say anything to anyone. I know a guy in the district attorney's office, a bulldog in the economic crimes unit. Let me make a call. We're going to do this by the book. We're going to make it stick. The next 2 weeks were a strange sort of limbo. A quiet, official investigation had begun. I had met with a detective, a sharp woman named Diaz, and given her everything. The permit violations, the trespassing video, the libelous notices, and the crown jewel, the 2 sets of invoices from Kevin. Meanwhile, Carol was emboldened by my silence. She probably thought her smear campaign had worked, that she had intimidated me into submission. She called for a special HOA meeting. The agenda was simple: a final vote to place a $1,000 fine on my property, authorize a lien, and schedule the immediate demolition of my shed. This was it. The final showdown. She was building her own gallows, and I was happy to hand her the rope. The night of the meeting, the community clubhouse was packed. Word had spread. This wasn't just about a shed anymore. This was a spectacle. Carol had made it a referendum on her power, and the whole neighborhood had turned out to see who would win. I arrived early and set up a small projector and a screen at the side of the room. Carol watched me with a look of smug contempt. What's this, Mr. Miller? A slideshow of your little tool shed? Something like that, I said with a thin smile. She started the meeting with a flourish, her voice booming with confidence. She delivered a 10-minute monologue about the importance of rules, community standards, and the cancer of noncompliance that threatened their suburban paradise. She portrayed herself as a beleaguered public servant, fighting to protect their property values from rogue elements like me. It was a masterpiece of self-aggrandizing delusion. When she was finally finished, she turned to me. Does the homeowner have any final words before the board casts its vote on these sanctions? I do, I said, standing up and walking to my laptop. I have quite a few words, actually. And pictures. I dimmed the lights and turned on the projector. The first image that filled the screen was a crystal-clear still from my security camera. It was a close-up of Carol's face, illuminated by her flashlight, as she peered into my shed window at 2 a.m. A collective gasp went through the room. This is footage from my legally installed security camera, I said, my voice echoing in the silent room. It shows the HOA president trespassing on my private property in the middle of the night. I'm not sure which bylaw covers that, but I'm sure we could find 1 inch. Carol was on her feet, her face as white as a ghost. This is an invasion of my privacy. You can't do this. It's my property, Carol. You were the one invading, I said calmly. But let's move on. I clicked to the next slide. It was a screenshot of the county permit database for the community gazebo, with the search results highlighted in red, NO records found. As we discussed at our last meeting, I continued, this is the official record for the gazebo. No permits. No inspections. A structure built with homeowner funds, on common property, that is not legally sanctioned and has never been inspected for safety. Every single person in this room is liable for that. The murmuring in the crowd grew louder. People were turning to look at each other, their expressions a mixture of anger and alarm. And that brings me to the money, I said, my voice turning hard. Let's talk about the new irrigation system. I put the next slide up. It was a copy of the invoice C&J Landscaping submitted to the HOA, for $85,000. Next to it, I projected the second invoice. The real one. The one for $42,000. On the right is the bill the HOA paid, I explained, pointing with a laser pointer. On the left is the actual cost of the work, provided by a source inside the company. That's a difference of $43,000. $43,000 of your money, the homeowner's money, that went, where, exactly? The room erupted. People were shouting questions. The treasurer looked like he was having a heart attack. Carol started screaming. It was a raw, animal sound of pure, cornered panic. Lies. It's all lies. He forged those documents. He's a criminal. She pointed a trembling finger at the treasurer. You. Tell them. Tell them the books are fine. You balance the books. The poor man shrank in his chair, unable to speak. Oh, the books were balanced, all right, I said, my voice cutting through the noise. The numbers all add up. The problem isn't the math. It's the fraud. In her hysteria, Carol made her final, fatal mistake. She turned on her own board member, her voice a shrill shriek. I told you this would happen. I told you we should have shredded the real books. A dead silence fell over the room. She had just confessed. In front of 50 witnesses. And right on cue, the back doors of the clubhouse opened. 2 figures stepped inside, their badges gleaming in the dim light. It was Detective Diaz and her partner. Standing right behind them was Frank, a look of profound satisfaction on his face. Carol Jenkins. Diaz's voice was calm but carried the undeniable weight of authority. You're under arrest for embezzlement, wire fraud, and conspiracy. Carol's world collapsed in that single moment. Her face crumpled. The rage and bluster evaporated, leaving behind a hollow-eyed, defeated woman. As the detectives moved forward, she just stood there, shaking. They cuffed her hands behind her back. The click of the metal echoed in the stunned silence of the room. As they led her away, she turned and locked her eyes on me. The hatred in them was pure and undiluted. You'll regret this, she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. I'll destroy you. It was the last, impotent threat of a fallen tyrant. I just looked at her, my expression unreadable, and said nothing. I didn't have to. The sound of the police car door slamming shut outside was the only reply necessary. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The HOA board was dissolved in disgrace. The treasurer, in exchange for his testimony, avoided jail time but was forced to pay restitution. Carol's husband, John, claimed he knew nothing, but his company was ruined and he filed for bankruptcy. Carol herself, faced with a mountain of evidence and her own public confession, took a plea deal. She was sentenced to 3 years in state prison and ordered to pay back every single dollar she had stolen from the community. Her house, the command center from which she had waged her reign of terror, was sold at auction to cover the debt. A new HOA board was elected, comprised of reasonable people who were more interested in maintaining the neighborhood than in wielding power. One of their first official acts was to pass a resolution. They formally apologized to me on behalf of the community. They expunged all the fines and rescinded the lien. And they passed a motion declaring my shed a welcome and aesthetically pleasing addition to the Maple Creek Estates community. The letter they sent me was framed and now hangs on the wall inside my shed, right next to a picture of Sarah. Life in Maple Creek returned to a quiet sort of peace, but it was a different kind of peace than the one I had originally sought. It wasn't the peace of avoidance, but the peace of resolution. The air felt cleaner. Neighbors started talking to each other more. Frank and I started a regular Saturday morning tradition of coffee on his porch. Sometimes, I stand in my backyard and look at the shed. It's more than just a place for Sarah's tools now. It's a monument to standing your ground. It's a testament to the fact that bullies, no matter how loud or powerful they seem, are often just hollow structures with rotten foundations. And if you know where to look, and you have the right tools, you can bring the whole thing down. I finally finished the project Sarah had started before she got sick, a small, intricately carved jewelry box. As I applied the final coat of varnish, the smell of cedar and lacquer filled the small space. It smelled like hard work. It smelled like justice. It smelled like peace. A peace I had earned.